The richest philosopher in Rome slept on the floor once a month. Buddhist monks eat one meal a day. A Greek philosopher lived in a barrel. They all did it for the same reason, and science now proves they were right. Across thousands of miles and thousands of years, separated by language, religion, and every possible cultural difference, the world's wisdom traditions arrived at a strange consensus. Comfort is dangerous. Not comfort as occasional relief, that is human and necessary, but comfort as a permanent condition. Comfort as the organizing principle of a life, that, they all agreed, makes you fragile, and fragility, in a world that will inevitably break you at some point, is the one thing you cannot afford. So they practiced discomfort, deliberately, regularly. Not because they enjoyed suffering, but because they understood something about the human organism that modern neuroscience has only recently begun to confirm. The system that is never stressed is the system that fails when stress arrives. Start with the most extreme example, because extremity clarifies. Diogenes of Sinope, born around 412 BC, was a philosopher who lived on the streets of Athens and Corinth. He slept in a large ceramic jar, a pithos, sometimes mistranslated as a barrel. He owned nothing but a cloak, a staff, and a bowl. When he saw a child drinking water with cupped hands, he threw the bowl away. Too much luxury. He walked barefoot in the snow. He rolled in hot sand in summer. He begged for food and slept in public. He urinated on people who annoyed him. He told Alexander the Great to move out of his sunlight. Diogenes was a cynic, from the Greek kynikos, meaning dog-like. The Cynics believed that civilization was a trap, that social convention was a prison, and that the only way to be truly free was to need nothing that could be taken away. If you do not need a house, you cannot be made homeless. If you do not need approval, you cannot be humiliated. If you do not need comfort, you cannot be broken by discomfort. This is an extreme position. Most of us are not going to live in a jar. But the kernel of the idea, that dependence on comfort is a form of slavery, echoed through every major philosophical tradition that followed. Seneca was the opposite of Diogenes in almost every way. He was one of the wealthiest men in Rome, a senator, a playwright, an advisor to Emperor Nero, owner of estates across the empire. His critics, both ancient and modern, have loved to point out the contradiction. A Stoic philosopher who preached simplicity while living in extraordinary luxury. But Seneca was aware of the contradiction. And his response was not to renounce his wealth, it was to practice losing it. He described the exercise in his letters to Lucilius. Set aside a certain number of days, during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, with coarse and rough dress, saying to yourself the while, "Is this the condition that I feared?" Once a month, sometimes more, Seneca would sleep on a hard surface. He would eat the simplest food. He would wear rough clothing. He would deliberately submit himself to the conditions he most feared, so that when those conditions arrived uninvited, as they eventually did, spectacularly, when Nero ordered his death, they would not be strangers. This is not a hair shirt. This is rehearsal. Seneca was not punishing himself for his wealth. He was inoculating himself against the loss of it. He was training his nervous system to remember that the worst-case scenario is survivable, so that if the worst case arrived, his mind would not shatter. "It is not that we dare not because things are difficult," he wrote. "It is that things are difficult because we dare not." Travel east, and the principle appears again in entirely different language, under entirely different assumptions, serving an entirely different metaphysics. In the Theravada Buddhist tradition, monks eat one meal per day, before noon. They own almost nothing: a robe, a bowl, a razor, a needle, a water strainer. They sleep on thin mats. They rise before dawn. In many traditions, they practice periods of complete silence lasting days or weeks. This is not arbitrary asceticism. It is part of a precise training program aimed at a specific goal, the reduction of attachment. The Buddhist diagnosis of suffering, dukkha, holds that we suffer not because of what happens to us, but because of our clinging to pleasure and our aversion to pain. Voluntary discomfort is the direct treatment for this condition. By choosing to experience hunger, cold, fatigue, and silence, by moving toward what the untrained mind recoils from, the monk weakens the grip of craving and aversion. The Hindu tradition has a parallel concept, tapas, often translated as austerity or heat. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna describes tapas of body, speech, and mind as essential to spiritual development. The yogi who fasts, who practices silence, who sits in discomfort during meditation, this person is not avoiding life. They are engaging with it at a deeper level than comfort allows. The Christian monastic tradition adds another voice. The Desert Fathers of 3rd and 4th century Egypt retreated to the wilderness specifically to encounter hardship. They fasted. They slept on stone. They endured extreme heat and cold. Saint Benedict's rule established a framework of voluntary simplicity that has governed monastic life for 1500 years. Different gods, different metaphysics, the same practice. So what did they all see? What is the principle that connects a cynic in a barrel, a Roman senator on his floor, a Buddhist monk with an empty bowl, and a desert father in the Egyptian wilderness? The principle is this: the capacity to endure discomfort is a skill, and like all skills, it atrophies without use. A body that is never cold loses its ability to thermoregulate. A person who has never been hungry cannot tolerate hunger when it arrives. A mind that has never sat with boredom or pain or silence will fracture when confronted with any of these things involuntarily. And life eventually confronts everyone involuntarily. The question is not whether difficulty will come. The question is whether you will have any capacity to meet it when it does. The ancient philosophers understood this intuitively. They saw that comfort was not neutral, it was corrosive. Not because pleasure is bad, but because unrestricted pleasure creates a progressive narrowing of tolerance. Each degree of comfort you become dependent on is a degree of freedom you lose. The person who cannot function without their morning routine, their perfect temperature, their specific brand of coffee, that person is not comfortable. They are captive. They have constructed a life that works only under ideal conditions. And ideal conditions, as Seneca would be the first to tell you, do not last. Modern science has given this ancient intuition a name: hormesis, the principle that moderate, controlled stress makes biological systems stronger. Cold exposure increases norepinephrine and improves immune function. Fasting triggers autophagy, the cellular recycling process that clears damaged proteins. Exercise, which is at its core the voluntary destruction of muscle fibers, produces growth only because the body overcompensates in repair. The muscle does not grow despite the stress. It grows because of it. The same principle operates psychologically. Exposure therapy, the gold standard for treating phobias and anxiety disorders, works by gradually introducing the feared stimulus in controlled doses. The patient who avoids all discomfort remains hostage to their fear. The patient who moves toward discomfort deliberately and repeatedly dismantles the fear from the inside. Nassim Nicholas Taleb, in Antifragile, formalized this observation. Some systems do not merely resist stress, they need it. Remove all stress, and they weaken. A bone that bears no weight loses density. A mind that faces no challenge loses resilience. A life that encounters no difficulty loses the capacity to handle difficulty. The ancient philosophers did not have the vocabulary of hormesis, but they had the practice. And the practice, it turns out, was precisely right. Now, the necessary question. Where is the line between voluntary discomfort and self-punishment, between training and masochism, between Seneca's deliberate practice and the toxic grind culture that tells you sleep is weakness and pain is the only proof of effort? The line is in tension. The masochist seeks pain as an end in itself. The practitioner uses discomfort as a tool, calibrated, temporary, and in service of something larger. Seneca did not sleep on the floor because he hated himself. He slept on the floor so that losing his bed would not destroy him. The Buddhist monk does not fast to punish the body. The monk fasts to understand the mind's relationship to craving. There is also the question of privilege. It is easy to romanticize voluntary discomfort when you have a warm house to return to. The person who sleeps on the floor by choice is in a fundamentally different position from the person who sleeps on the floor because they have no alternative. Seneca could afford to practice poverty. Diogenes arguably could not. His philosophical experiment and his material reality were the same thing. This distinction matters. Voluntary discomfort is not a substitute for working to reduce involuntary suffering. It does not excuse indifference to poverty, inequality, or injustice. The practice makes sense only within a framework that takes those things seriously, that sees voluntary hardship as training for the work of making the world better, not as a reason to accept the world as it is. The ancient philosophers at their best understood this. Seneca's practice of poverty was meant to prepare him for service, not to replace it. The Buddhist tradition of renunciation exists within a larger framework of compassion. Diogenes' provocation was aimed at a complacent society, not at the already suffering. You do not need to live in a barrel. You do not need to fast for days, or sleep on stone, or give away everything you own. But you might benefit from noticing how carefully you have arranged your life to avoid discomfort, and from asking whether that arrangement is protecting you or imprisoning you. The cold shower is the contemporary cliché, and there is something slightly absurd about comparing it to what Seneca or the Desert Fathers endured. But the principle is the same, scaled down, the moment when the cold water hits and every nerve in your body screams, "Get out," and you stay. That is a micro-rehearsal for every moment in life, when your instinct will be to flee from difficulty and your character will be measured by whether you stay. It does not have to be cold water. It can be the difficult conversation you have been avoiding, the creative project you keep putting off because you might fail, the silence you fill with your phone because being alone with your thoughts is uncomfortable. Every time you choose the harder path, not out of obligation or guilt, but out of the clear-eyed recognition that comfort, unchecked, makes you smaller, you are doing what the philosophers did. You are training for a life that will not always be gentle. The richest Stoic in Rome, a cynic in a clay jar, saffron-robed monks in the mist, desert hermits under a merciless sun. They did not coordinate. They did not read each other's texts. They arrived at the same practice independently, across centuries and continents, because they were all looking at the same human nature, and they all saw the same vulnerability. Comfort is not the enemy, but the worship of comfort, the quiet, constant rearrangement of life to avoid all friction, all difficulty, all encounters with the limits of your tolerance. That is a kind of death, a slow one, the kind where everything is pleasant and nothing is meaningful. The examined life is not a comfortable life. It is a life that has looked at comfort clearly and decided that some things matter more. That the capacity to endure, to sit with what is hard, to stay when every instinct says leave, to choose the floor when the bed is right there, is not a punishment. It is a freedom. The deepest kind. The kind that no one can take from you, because you built it yourself. The philosophers all knew this. Perhaps it is time we remembered.